Hi, my name is Kaya Lester, and today I will be giving a voice narrated presentation over the evolution of gender inclusivity as well as women's media perception. In addition to that, we will also discuss the various of barriers overcome by minorities originating from a patriarchal system, as well as gain further insight from psychologists, researchers, and regarding our discussions today. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. So, first, we're going to define gender inclusivity and perception in the media. According to Gender Spectrum, inclusivity in its very definition means to be open to everyone and not limited to certain people. In regard to gender, this means that services, establishments, schools, practitioners, government agencies, and other institutions are welcoming of all, regardless of their gender identity or expression. Examples include equality at home, equal pay for equal work, zero tolerance for sexual harassment or gender bias. According to Crawford in our book, women are generally underrepresented in the media. Although 51% of the population is female, women often appear less in the media than men and are usually misrepresented or stereotyped to fit the female gender role. So, where exactly did it all begin? So, starting from around the 1850s into the early 1920s, we began to see women become more independent and heavily challenge patriarchal dominance in the media, politics, and women's representation in society. Some key figures who had a major influence on these decisions included Eleanor Roosevelt, Susan B. Anthony, and even women in the entertainment industry, such as flappers. During this time, women were also becoming more expressive by embracing their individual liberty, sexual freedom, and independence. In this motion, we first are introduced to feminism. And although these beginning stages of major success for women were taking off, women still faced harsh criticism and even harassment. So these women, in particular to this time period, challenged gender politics. Psychologically and socially, women at this time were viewed as being domestic, intellectually inferior, and submissive to men. However, these theories are challenged once women strategically achieve their strive for social and economic change. In 1848, we have the Seneca Falls Convention, which was held to discuss social, civil, and religious rights of women. In 1920, U.S. Congress grants white women the right to vote, while minority persons of color are still denied. So, how exactly were these women in this time period portrayed by the media? These women, like many other women, were portrayed both positively and negatively in their event of their influence. So, negatively, a woman who was invested in politics or promoting social change was considered to be radical, arbitrary, unethical, and even less feminine or quote unquote not a woman. Whereas a woman who was embracing her sexuality or was liberated was seen as shameless, promiscuous, attention seeking, or even a prostitute. However, on the other hand, from a more positive aspect, these women at this time were also portrayed as being strong, independent, and influential figures regardless of their status, wealth, or background. These steps to inclusivity were major milestones which later helped set the precedent for women's rights. In addition, new psychological and social perceptions of women were emerging. So, next, we're going to move on to the 1930s into the 1970s. So, over the course for the next 40 years, we began to see women in the media portrayed in many different aspects, both psychologically and socially. Women were also now challenging gender roles and redefining stereotypes prematurely assigned to them. So, these women during this particular time period challenged gender roles. Psychologically and socially at this time, women were viewed as fragile, simple tasks, and incapable of participating in challenging work environments. In the 1930s throughout the 1940s, more than 6 million women worked wartime jobs in factories during World War II. 3 million volunteered for the Red Cross, and over 200,000 served in the military. In the 1950s throughout the 1960s, women's driving rate has now increased, and almost half of adult American women had a driver's license. By 1960, 39% of registered drivers were women compared to 53.2 million men. In the 1970s now, women began to integrate in male dominated careers, however, they still were not receiving equal pay or benefits. So, how are these women portrayed in the media? Negatively, during the 1950s, women were mainly portrayed as being dedicated housewives and were expected to remain motherly, nurturing, and sacrificial, meaning that marriage and bearing children was far more important than working or receiving higher education. Women who worked were also considered selfish. Women are also still considered to be somewhat submissive to their men or their husbands during this time. Positively, women during the 30s and 40s were portrayed as being hard workers, they were empowering, and they were seen as independent. In the 70s, women were then portrayed as liberals, fierce, and innovational. And if you are wondering as to why we don't have a lot of positive aspects to mention about the 1950s, we saw a really drastic shift in between the progress that women were making from the 30s and 40s into the 50s. During that time into the 50s now, men had now came back from war. People were beginning to get married again and starting families, and men took back their jobs. So, of course, which led us to either women who still wanted to work, or there were still the majority who still just decided to be a housewife, tend to their motherly duties, etc. So, back to the 1970s, where women were now portrayed as liberals and etc. During this time, also, we see the second wave of feminism erode. Women make major progress in the women's movement, attracting women of all races, backgrounds, and political beliefs. In 1975, the Equal Pay Act is enforced, and in 1976, the Sex Discrimination Order is also enforced. So now we're moving on to the 1980s into present day. During this time period recently, women have made exceptional progress with representation in the workforce, education, women's rights, sexual and relational liberation, and individuality. We also begin to see more inclusiveness for minority women. So, the shift to inclusivity. From the 1980s to the 1990s, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, more than half of bachelor degrees were awarded to women in the early 80s. Women's work salaries also became increased to their male counterparts. From the 2000s to the 2010s, women were no longer restricted to gender roles conforming to society, meaning that they no longer felt pressured to be the household cook, clean, or looking after children. Now, moving into present day, we see women break political and social boundaries. Kamala Harris is elected as the U.S. Vice President and is the first woman and woman of color to do so. And we also see movements such as the Me Too movement take off and launch, which ended up serving significant impact protecting women's rights. So, how are women today portrayed in the media? So today, women today are portrayed in the media in a number of ways. We see some women being portrayed as the hardworking, independent, and self-sufficient. And now we also see women that, of course, are more liberated. They're liberated and they're expressive within their identities and their sexuality, and just anything that may still be considered to go against societal norms and expectations. In addition to that, also, women, I think, are now being encouraged to be portrayed as more as themselves. However, still at the time that we're in, where now social media is at an all-time high, it also does create a deterrent for self-consciousness within body image, perception, and of course, just comparison with others. So While women have made a lot of progress, I mean, a lot of progress, there is still some work that has to be done. But overall, women have made tremendous progress, both politically, economically, socially, culturally, as what we've seen throughout this presentation. So, for my second major source, I chose to have a personal interview with my licensed psychotherapist who also specializes in behavioral, cognitive, and psychoanalysis. When asked the following questions about her thoughts regarding the evolution of gender perception and inclusivity, these were her responses. Question 1. Why do you think women were so successful with their endeavors to maintain inclusiveness? She responded, women had a political and cultural system designed against them, so overcoming these bouts of oppression weren't easy. It took individuals with courage, confidence, and a desire for change to accomplish all that they did. Question 2. Do you agree with some perceptions or stereotypes about women? She says, no, not necessarily. I understand why certain roles and expectations were thought of for women because most align femininity with woman/motherhood, when the two are in fact different from each other. And lastly, for the final question, I asked, what further changes do you think should be made for true gender inclusiveness? She states, for starters, society will have to become more accepting and willing to understand individuals as who they are without shaming them when they resist social conformity. In addition to that, the topics of gender and sex should be discussed and taught earlier on in age. A lot of our outdated or biased thoughts originate from what we were taught at a young age. Other factors, such as one's environment, background, and religious political beliefs, also influence our perception of gender. And lastly, I have my work cited from our book, Gender, Women in Psychology by Mary Crawford, as well as a few works cited from different websites and, of course, through my major secondary source. Thank you so much for listening and being present during my presentation, and I hope that you enjoyed it.